The world of Game of Thrones, the world of A Song of Ice and Fire is incredibly unique, but nothing is more unique than the characters. You think you love a character and then 2 chapters later they turn into a rapist and you're like, god damn. I just finished watching an edit of them on TikTok that I just reposted. But a lot of people always had the question, who is the main character of the story? Who is the protagonist of the story like Frodo and Anakin? Well, there's many ways to find out this answer, including the author's answer to this question, which we'll get to in a sec. But the possibilities for the protagonist, in my opinion, are Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister, Daenerys Targaryen, Bran, believe it or not, and there's also the possibility of no protagonist, no main character, and the possibility of multiple main characters. Either way, we have a lot to unfold here, and let's start off with my favorite character, the dwarf, the imp, the Westeros Bill Cosby himself, Tyrion Lannister. Now Tyrion has one of the strongest claims to being the protagonist of the series. He is not only my favorite character, but the author of the book's favorite character, George R.R. Martin. George reminds us this like every interview he does.
Well, Tyrion is my favorite. There's no doubt about that. You know, he's the easiest to write. At least for the first 3 books, he was the easiest to write. He got harder to write with book 5 in particular because he's in a very dark place right there. And but he's witty and he's intelligent. And Tyrion is almost like what I wish I could be because I'm not as witty as Tyrion. Well, I am as witty as Tyrion because I invent all of the witty things that Tyrion said.
But that's not the main reason why Tyrion has such a strong claim to being the main character. His strongest claim comes from the fact that in the books, he has the most amount of chapters, and in the Game of Thrones TV show, he has the most amount of screen time. And I personally always argue that the TV show only really makes sense when you look at it from Tyrion's point of view, because the writers definitely favor Tyrion in almost every way. But that's besides the point. But Tyrion, without a doubt having the most amount of chapters in the books, is a crazy strong claim for him that you have to remember. And him being George's favorite character does help a lot. And if you're someone who wants to see less of Tyrion in the next book, well, I got some bad news for you, my friend. If you didn't know, when it comes to The Winds of Winter, a book we may or may never get, George Martin has confirmed many times that he is done writing a few of the characters.
And I think I'm about 3/4 of the way done. I'm done with some of the characters. You know, the characters all interweave.
Sure.
So I've actually finished with a couple of the characters. I got their whole story, but not others. So I have to finish all that weaving, but it's still going to take me a while.
And Tyrion is one of the characters that George has confirmed that he is done writing. And George has stated that there is a lot of Tyrion in The Winds of Winter. Tyrion most likely has the most amount of chapters in The Winds of Winter, if not like top 2. So Tyrion's claim is strong. But a character whose claim is surprisingly also strong is Bran Stark. Now if you watch the TV show you might laugh at this, but in the books it's a completely different story. This motherfucker in the books is a force to be reckoned with. Bran hasn't killed his mentally handicapped friend with the Time Stone just yet, but you bet your ass it's coming in the next book. But Bran was the first real chapter of the books, and Bran is one of, if not the first ever character George has created for A Song of Ice and Fire.
But I'm hoping you can remember for us the scene or the image that launched the series, A Song of Ice and Fire.
It was the first chapter of the novel Game of Thrones, not the prologue, which actually appears first. I wrote that later, but it was the chapter where they Bran viewpoint and they ride out to see the deserter beheaded, and then they find the direwolf pups in the summer snow. But it came to me so vividly and so strongly that I just felt compelled that I had to write it. So I put aside what I was doing and I wrote that chapter, and that chapter led to another chapter, and that chapter led to another chapter, and you know, at a certain...
And a few more.
Yeah. Not all there in the summer of 1991. But I knew I was doomed when I drew the map.
Now if you're someone who doesn't want spoilers for The Winds of Winter and especially A Dream of Spring, this is your chance to be a pussy and click off. But from a behind the scenes book that George R.R. Martin has personally worked with, called Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, we do know for an absolute fact that Bran becoming king is going to happen in the books as well. He gave it to the writers. I know that sounds horrible. If you only watch the show, finding out Bran will also be the king in the books is like finding out the exact day your grandma's gonna fall down the stairs. But in the books it does make a lot of sense, but that's a topic for another video I plan on making. But either way, we do know Bran will be king at the end of the books. And it's not going to happen like this if you're worried.
And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
And because Bran will be king and Bran is our first real POV in the books, Bran has a pretty strong claim for being the main character. But I do have to say, I don't think he is. He has a really good claim. I don't blame anyone who thinks he is. But Bran is like number 7 in chapters. I do see that rapidly increasing, but probably not to the point where he becomes like top 3 or something. But don't worry, we are not done with Bran just yet. But the next person's claim we have to talk about is the girl from the other continent, Daenerys Targaryen. Daenerys plays a huge role in the story. She has the 4th most chapters in the books, which is pretty low but not incredibly low. But just like how Tyrion is our main point of view for the Game of Thrones, and Jon Snow is our main point of view for the threat against the zombies who are trying to get past the southern Mexican border, Daenerys is our main point of view for dragons and fire. And George has reaffirmed this many times in interviews as well.
Well, of course, the two outlying ones, the things that are going north of the wall, and Daenerys Targaryen on the other continent with her dragons are of course the ice and fire of the title, A Song of Ice and Fire.
So Daenerys is a major point of view in the story, and Daenerys is the closest to dragons, or at least as of right now. So that is a pretty good claim as well. George Martin never said that Daenerys is his favorite character, but he has alluded to Arya usually being his second favorite character and Daenerys usually being like 3rd or 4th. But I doubt George really cares about his ranking. I'm sure he loves all of his characters. But George said he created the character of Daenerys from a personal story from his childhood. So he does have a personal connection to Daenerys.
From my mother's stories, I always had this kind of sense that I was like disinherited royalty. You know, here was this dock that my great-grandfather built, wasn't ours anymore. Here was this house that my mother had been born in. We didn't own this house anymore. We didn't own any house. We had an apartment, you know? So it was like, oh, I came from greatness, like Danny. And I will take back what is mine with fire and blood.
But in my opinion, Daenerys' claim is incredibly strong. I think it's almost as strong as Tyrion's, if not just slightly less than his. But we will get back to her again. But let's talk about the final candidate, Jon Snow. Now, Jon Snow is currently more dead than Arthur Morgan in the books. He's been lying flat for like 14 years now, almost as old as he was when the books began. But behind the scenes, it's pretty much confirmed that he will come back. We already know that George gave the TV show writers an outline. That's one piece of evidence. And George did tell the TV show writers in season 1 that the endgame of the story is all about Jon Snow and Daenerys meeting each other. And unless you're Casper the Ghost, you can't meet a girl if you're dead. So Jon Snow will most likely come back to life. And the book series is called A Song of Ice and Fire. And inside the canon, the Targaryens are called Fire, and the Starks are called Ice. In House of the Dragon Season 2, Jace and Cregan make a pact, and this gay friendship in the books is called A Pact of Ice and Fire. Really powerful stuff. And even though Jon being a Targaryen isn't 100% confirmed in the books, we do know behind the scenes, George Martin did tell the TV show writers that they were correct on Rhaegar being Jon Snow's father, and Lyanna being Jon Snow's mother. The writers even confirmed this in an interview, and they said George confirmed this before season 1 of Game of Thrones, which is actually very interesting.
And George, you guys obviously hit it off.
We took him out for lunch here in LA at the Palm, and we had a 4-hour lunch. And at the very end of lunch, he was sitting there kind of looking between the two of us, and he said, "Who was Jon Snow's mother?"
Oh.
And it was a test question. And I'll always remember this. And George had a little bit of butter in his beard.
Who fielded that question?
We had weirdly, we had both talked about it because we'd read the book again by that point. And when you read it a second time, and if you're paying attention, it's you can kind of tell who Jon Snow's mother is.
I see.
Yeah. So we had an answer that we thought was right, and turned out not to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet, but it turned out to be the right answer.
Okay, so we know from the show that's the same mother from the book that was in the show.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So the book series is called A Song of Ice and Fire. And inside the canon, like the actual canon story, Jon is a son of Ice and Fire. And this is even more of a W because the theory of the Starks being related to the White Walkers, but that's a topic for another video I'll talk about. But is Jon Snow the protagonist? Well, believe it or not, his claim gets even stronger. Jon Snow has the second most amount of chapters in the books, and the second most amount of screen time in the show. But here's the craziest thing, and I'm not saying this to put Jon Snow's meat in my mouth. Tyrion's meat is a lot deeper in my mouth, and even though I like it, it's more meat than I can handle. But the thing that is much crazier is that despite not having the most amount of chapters in the books, and not even being part of the main Game of Thrones storyline, Jon Snow has the most amount of mentions in the books. Which is incredibly ironic because Jon Snow's main theme is that no one cares about him as much as the other Starks' names. But is Jon Snow the main character of A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, let's look at this logically. Usually when George Martin talks about the story of Ice and Fire, he always says the Stark family is the core of the story and the heart of the story. A Song of Ice and Fire, no matter what, is a story about the Starks. And this is coming from a Tyrion fan. So as much as I love Tyrion and Daenerys, I unfortunately do have to take them out of the equation for now. Just for now though. They are not Starks. And no, Jon isn't legally one either, but he has the blood, so we're gonna include him as a Stark. And the blood is very important to the magic. And it does play a huge role in Jon's overall story.
And you are a Stark. You might not have my name, but you have my blood.
If you remove all the Starks, the story simply does not work. If you remove Daenerys, 82% of the story remains exactly the same. If you remove Tyrion, a good portion of the story remains exactly the same. If you remove all the Lannisters, that's only 3 POVs you're affecting. But if you remove the Starks, the story simply does not work. And like I said, George has stated this many times. He stated that the Starks are the core of the story, just like how the Targaryens are the core of House of the Dragon. So the question is, what's the answer? What is the answer to the question of who is the main character of the story? Well, believe it or not, George Martin has answered this question directly, so let's see what he says.
It's one story. One very complex story with a lot of viewpoint characters and interweaving, but still one story.
If you had to say it was any one person's story.
It's not.
No.
No.
Well, that kind of ruins everything. Nah, I'm joking. Two things can be true at the same time. George Martin has said the story isn't about anyone, but technically speaking, the story is about everyone. Sansa is the protagonist of her story, Tyrion is the protagonist of his story, Jon is the protagonist of his story. To make it easier to understand, every POV character are the main characters of their own story. That's kind of what George is kind of hinting to in my opinion. But again, that doesn't negate everything else George has said. The Starks are still the core of the main series. Daenerys is still fire, Jon is still fire and ice. Bran is still our first chapter and most likely our last chapter, and Tyrion does have the most amount of chapters in the books. So in my opinion, the story is about the Starks, and Jon, Tyrion, and Daenerys are essentially like the big three of the series. So yeah, hopefully this video made sense, because there's a lot of Daenerys fans and Jon fans who think the story is solely about them, which is just not true. But they are a part of the big three, while the Starks are the actual core of the story. But yeah, that's it for this video. Like, subscribe, and peace.